There's something different about people who grew up during the Cold War. Maybe it's the way they scan a room when they enter, always noting exits and escape routes. Maybe it's how they stockpile essentials without seeming paranoid. Or maybe it's that peculiar mixture of vigilance and resignation that seems wired into their very DNA. Because the Cold War didn't just shape geopolitics, it forged a specific type of psychological architecture that researchers are only now beginning to decode. And trust me, by the end of this series, you're going to understand why growing up under the shadow of nuclear annihilation created some of the most psychologically complex and paradoxically resilient people walking among us today. Let's start with something that defined Cold War childhood in ways most people never consider. Picture yourself as a 7-year-old sitting at your wooden desk in Mrs. Johnson's second-grade classroom. The morning sun is streaming through tall windows when suddenly, without warning, a sharp whistle pierces the air. Before you can even process what's happening, you hear the command that will echo through your dreams for decades to come. Cover. In less than 2 seconds, you've dropped to your knees, crawled under that heavy wooden desk, and clasped your small hands around the back of your head. Your heart is pounding, but this isn't your first drill. You've done this dozens of times before. You know the routine by now. This was duck and cover, and for millions of American children, it became as routine as the Pledge of Allegiance. You didn't question why you were practicing to survive a nuclear blast. You didn't wonder if that desk would actually protect you from atomic fire. You just did it because the adults told you to. And in those moments, crouched beneath furniture that wouldn't survive a strong wind, let alone a nuclear explosion, your brain was being rewired in ways that would last a lifetime. Here's what's remarkable about this. Generation. By 1960, 60% of children reported having nightmares related to nuclear war. Not nightmares about monsters under the bed or getting lost in the woods. Nightmares about the world ending in a flash of light. These weren't abstract fears picked up from scary movies. These were concrete anxieties about a very real possibility that adults discussed openly at dinner tables, in newspapers, and on television every single day. But something unexpected happened to these children's psychology. Instead of creating a generation of paralyzed, anxious adults, this constant exposure to existential threat produced people with an unusual relationship to fear itself. When you've spent your childhood practicing for the apocalypse, everyday problems lose some of their power to overwhelm you. Car trouble doesn't feel catastrophic when you've mentally prepared for nuclear winter. A job interview seems manageable when you've rehearsed the end of civilization. This generation developed what psychologists now call threat calibration, an ability to assess real danger versus imagined danger with startling accuracy. They learned young that there are problems you can solve and problems you simply have to live with. And the biggest problem of all, the one that could erase everything in 30 minutes, was completely beyond their control. So they focused on what they could control instead. Now let's talk about what happened when these children went home after school. You'd walk through your front door, maybe grab a snack from the kitchen, and then settle in front of the television for your afternoon shows. But mixed in with cartoons and game shows were images that would be considered deeply traumatic by today's standards. Footage from Vietnam played during dinner. News anchors discussed missile gaps and nuclear stockpiles while you did your homework. The evening news didn't shield you from the realities of a world at war. It brought them directly into your living room in vivid detail. These children absorbed information about geopolitical tension, military strategy, and international conflict at ages when previous generations were still believing in Santa Claus. By the time they were 10 years old, most Cold War kids could explain the basic principles of nuclear deterrence, identify the major players in global politics, and understand why certain countries were considered friends or enemies. This wasn't because they were particularly advanced students. It was because survival in their world required this knowledge. But here's where the psychology gets truly fascinating. Despite being constantly exposed to discussions of nuclear annihilation, these children maintained what researchers call productive cognitive dissonance. They could simultaneously believe that the world might end tomorrow and still plan for their future. They could acknowledge the very real possibility of nuclear war, while still doing their homework, playing with friends, and dreaming about what they wanted to be when they grew up. This mental flexibility became one of their greatest psychological assets. As adults, They can hold contradictory truths without falling apart. They can hope for the best while preparing for the worst. They can acknowledge serious problems without being consumed by despair. This isn't denial or compartmentalization. It's a sophisticated form of mental processing that allows them to function effectively in uncertain circumstances. Consider what it meant to be a child during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. For 13 days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Adults spoke in hushed tones about evacuation plans and fallout shelters. Some families packed emergency bags. Others stockpiled food and water. Children watched their parents' faces for clues about how scared they should be. But the adults were just as frightened and uncertain as everyone else. During those 2 weeks, an entire generation of children learned that the adults they trusted to keep them safe were actually powerless against the forces that truly threatened their world. This realization could have been devastating. Instead, it taught them something valuable about the nature of security itself. Real safety doesn't come from having adults fix every problem. Real safety comes from developing your own internal resources for dealing with uncertainty. The children who lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis learned to trust their own judgment about risk and danger. They stopped expecting others to eliminate threats and started focusing on how to navigate them. They developed what psychologists call internal locus of control, the belief that their actions and decisions have more impact on their lives than external circumstances or other people's choices. This psychological shift had profound implications for how they approached relationships, careers, and major life decisions as adults. They became people who don't wait for permission to act, who don't expect others to solve their problems, and who aren't paralyzed by uncertainty, because uncertainty was the backdrop of their entire childhood. But the Cold War didn't just teach these children about global politics and nuclear strategy. It taught them about the fragility of civilization itself. They understood from a very young age that the world they knew could disappear overnight, not through natural disaster or gradual change, but through human decisions made in rooms they would never see by people they would never meet. This awareness created a unique appreciation for stability when it existed and resilience when it didn't. Cold War children learned not to take peaceful moments for granted. They developed an ability to find meaning and joy even when the future felt uncertain. They became experts at living fully in the present while keeping one eye on the horizon. The psychological impact of growing up during the Cold War extended far beyond individual children and families. It shaped an entire generation's relationship with authority, government, and institutions. These children watched adults struggle with problems that had no clear solutions. They saw leaders make decisions based on incomplete information and conflicting priorities. They learned early that authority figures are human beings making their best guesses about impossible situations. This understanding created adults who respect competence but question credentials, who follow leaders who earn trust rather than demand it, and who understand that healthy skepticism isn't the same as cynicism. They learned that asking difficult questions isn't disrespectful when the stakes are high enough. The classroom wasn't the only place where Cold War psychology was being shaped. Think about what happened when these children walked into their neighborhood grocery stores with their mothers. There, next to the breakfast cereals and canned vegetables, they'd see something that previous generations never encountered. Fallout shelter supplies, water purification tablets, emergency rations designed to last for weeks underground, civil defense pamphlets explaining how to build a backyard bunker. For most families, these weren't purchases they actually made. They were reminders of possibilities they had to consider. Your mother might pick up a can of soup and wonder aloud whether she should buy extra cases, just in case. Your father might examine a battery-powered radio and calculate how long it would run during an extended emergency. These weren't conversations about camping trips or power outages. These were discussions about survival after civilization collapsed. This constant exposure to emergency preparedness thinking created children who developed what researchers now call scenario planning minds. They learned to think through multiple possible outcomes for any situation. They became natural strategists, always considering backup plans and alternative approaches. When they played games, they thought several moves ahead. When they made decisions, they considered consequences that might not become apparent for months or years. This mental habit of thinking through worst-case scenarios might sound like a recipe for anxiety, but it actually produced the opposite effect. When you've already mentally rehearsed how you'd handle disaster, smaller setbacks don't throw you off balance. When you've thought through what you'd do if everything went wrong, everyday problems feel manageable by comparison. These children also learned something profound about the relationship between individual action and historical forces. They understood that their personal choices mattered, but that massive events beyond their control could reshape everything overnight. This created adults who work hard to influence what they can while accepting what they cannot. They became people who don't waste energy fighting unchangeable circumstances, but who also don't give up on making positive changes in their immediate sphere of influence. The technology of the Cold War era reinforced these psychological patterns in unexpected ways. Consider what it meant to get news during this period. There was no internet, no social media, no instant updates on your phone. Information came through specific channels at specific times. The evening news aired at 6 o'clock. The newspaper arrived in the morning. Radio broadcasts happened on schedule. This meant that Cold War children learned to live with information gaps. They might hear about a crisis developing somewhere in the world, then have to wait hours or even days to learn what happened next. They became comfortable with not knowing everything immediately. They developed patience for ambiguity and uncertainty in ways that constant connectivity makes nearly impossible today. But when news did arrive, it carried weight. There was no endless scroll of updates to dilute its impact. When Walter Cronkite announced something significant, families stopped what they were doing to listen. When newspapers carried headlines about international tensions, people read every word. This created a generation that learned to distinguish between important information and background noise. The physical environment of Cold War childhood reinforced these psychological patterns as well. These children grew up in neighborhoods where air raid sirens were tested regularly. They lived in communities where civil defense wardens conducted drills and distributed emergency information. They attended schools where fallout shelter signs marked basement rooms that might someday save their lives. This constant presence of emergency infrastructure created a unique relationship with preparedness. It wasn't paranoia when the government was officially telling everyone to get ready for potential disaster. It wasn't excessive caution when civil defense was a legitimate community responsibility. These children learned that reasonable people prepare for unlikely but catastrophic events. The social dynamics of Cold War childhood were equally formative. These children played together in an environment where global politics affected their daily conversations. They traded baseball cards while discussing which countries had nuclear weapons. They built snow forts while debating whether the Soviet Union was planning an invasion. They navigated typical childhood friendships while processing information about ideological conflicts that could determine their future survival. This created children who learned to maintain normal relationships while acknowledging abnormal circumstances. They developed social skills that allowed them to connect with others without ignoring the larger context of their historical moment. They became people who could enjoy simple pleasures while remaining aware of complex realities. The educational system during this period reflected these psychological pressures in fascinating ways. Teachers had to balance normal curriculum requirements with the practical reality that their students might need survival skills more than academic knowledge. Schools conducted regular drills, not just for fires or severe weather, but for nuclear attacks. Students learned traditional subjects like math and literature alongside civil defense procedures and emergency protocols. This educational environment created learners who understood that knowledge serves practical purposes. They didn't separate academic learning from real-world application because their real world included genuine existential threats. They developed a pragmatic approach to education that focused on skills and information that might actually prove useful rather than purely theoretical knowledge. The family dynamics of Cold War households were shaped by these pressures as well. Parents had to explain complex geopolitical situations to children while maintaining some sense of security and stability. They had to discuss very real dangers without creating paralyzing fear. They had to prepare their families for potential emergencies while encouraging normal childhood development and optimism about the future. This created family conversations unlike any previous generation had experienced. Dinner table discussions might move seamlessly from school activities to international tensions, from weekend plans to emergency procedures. Children learned to participate in adult conversations about serious topics while maintaining their childhood interests and activities. These family dynamics produced children who felt included in important discussions rather than protected from them. They developed early maturity in some areas while maintaining normal childhood development in others. They learned that being young didn't mean being ignorant about the world, but it also didn't mean carrying adult responsibilities before they were ready. The psychological architecture built during these Cold War childhoods created adults with distinctive characteristics that persist today. They approach uncertainty with unusual calm, because uncertainty was the constant backdrop of their formative years. They make decisions quickly when necessary, because they learned early that hesitation could have serious consequences. They value preparation without becoming obsessive about it, because they understand the difference between reasonable caution and paralyzing fear. These adults handle crisis situations with a particular kind of composure that seems almost supernatural to people who didn't grow up with the same psychological conditioning. When unexpected problems arise, they don't panic or freeze. Instead, they shift into what researchers call assessment mode, quickly evaluating what can be controlled, what must be accepted, and what actions need to be taken immediately. This isn't learned behavior from self-help books or management training. This is hardwired response patterns developed during childhood when rapid threat assessment was a survival skill. The Cold War generation also developed an unusual relationship with material possessions and security. These children watched their parents make purchasing decisions based on emergency preparedness considerations. Should we buy the house with a basement that could serve as a shelter? Should we invest in a generator? Should we keep extra supplies on hand? This created adults who think differently about ownership and accumulation. They don't hoard compulsively, but they do maintain what they call reasonable reserves. They keep extra batteries, canned goods, and basic supplies, not because they're expecting disaster, but because they learned early that being prepared is simply good sense. When other people see this behavior, they might call it paranoid. But for the Cold War generation, it's just practical wisdom gained through experience. Consider what it meant to plan for the future, when that future was genuinely uncertain. Cold War children had to learn how to set goals and work toward them while acknowledging that everything could change overnight. They developed what psychologists now recognize as flexible commitment, the ability to pursue objectives wholeheartedly while remaining ready to adapt when circumstances change. This created adults who can pivot quickly when plans don't work out. They don't get stuck mourning what might have been because they never fully believed in guaranteed outcomes anyway. They learn to invest energy in processes rather than becoming emotionally attached to specific results. They work hard toward their goals while holding those goals lightly enough to change direction when necessary. The entertainment and media consumption patterns of Cold War childhood reinforce these psychological developments in subtle but significant ways. These children watched television shows and movies that didn't shy away from serious themes. They saw programs that dealt with war, conflict, moral complexity, and difficult choices. They weren't protected from stories about good people making hard decisions in impossible circumstances. This media environment created children who developed sophisticated moral reasoning at early ages. They learned that heroes sometimes had to make terrible choices, that good intentions didn't guarantee good outcomes, and that real courage often meant acting despite fear rather than acting without fear. They absorbed stories that prepared them psychologically for a world where clear-cut answers were rare and moral ambiguity was common. The playground dynamics during this era reflected these broader psychological patterns as well. Children played games that incorporated themes from the adult world around them. They built elaborate scenarios involving spies, secret missions, and international intrigue. They created imaginary worlds where they had to make strategic decisions about alliances and enemies. These weren't games, divorced from reality. They were practice sessions for the complex social and political navigation these children sensed they would need as adults. This play created children who understood instinctively that relationships involve strategy, that trust must be earned and maintained, and that loyalty requires both giving and receiving. They learned to read social situations for underlying tensions and hidden agendas. They developed what researchers call social radar, an ability to detect when group dynamics are shifting, or when individual motivations might not align with stated intentions. The religious and philosophical discussions in Cold War households took on particular intensity because families were grappling with ultimate questions about life, death, and meaning in very immediate ways. Children heard adults wrestling with questions about divine justice, human nature, and the purpose of existence when existence itself felt precarious. These weren't abstract theological debates. These were urgent conversations about how to find meaning when the world might end tomorrow. This spiritual environment created children who developed deep philosophical frameworks at early ages. They learned to think about big questions, not as intellectual exercises, but as practical necessities. They had to develop their own understanding of what made life worth living when that life could be cut short by forces beyond anyone's control. This created adults who can find purpose and meaning even in very difficult circumstances. The economic consciousness of Cold War children was shaped by their understanding that prosperity could disappear as quickly as everything else. They watched their parents make financial decisions, influenced by the possibility that normal economic systems might not continue indefinitely. Should we invest in property that might become worthless? Should we keep cash on hand in case banks close? Should we learn skills that would be valuable even if modern civilization collapsed? This created a generation with a complex relationship to wealth and security. They appreciate prosperity when they have it, but they don't depend on it psychologically. They understand that financial security is temporary, and that real security comes from skills, relationships, and internal resources rather than external accumulation. They learn to distinguish between wanting things and needing things, between comfort and survival. The technological awareness of Cold War children was shaped by their understanding that the same scientific advances that improved daily life also created the possibility of universal destruction. They grew up knowing that nuclear energy could power cities or destroy them, that rockets could explore space or deliver warheads, that radio waves could carry entertainment or military communications. This created a sophisticated understanding of technology as a double-edged tool that reflects human intentions rather than determining them. These children learn to appreciate technological progress while remaining aware of its potential for misuse. They became adults who can embrace new innovations without naive optimism about their inevitable benefits. They understand that every powerful tool requires wisdom about how to use it responsibly. They don't fear technology, but they also don't worship it. The seasonal rhythms of Cold War childhood were punctuated by moments of heightened international tension that could disrupt normal patterns without warning. Children might be planning summer vacations, while adults whispered about missile buildups. They might be preparing for school, while newspapers carried headlines about diplomatic crises. They learned that personal plans had to remain flexible because larger forces could reshape everything overnight. This created adults who can enjoy peaceful moments fully while remaining psychologically prepared for disruption. They don't take stability for granted, but they also don't let awareness of instability prevent them from engaging fully with life. They learn to live with what researchers call adaptive alertness, a state of relaxed readiness that allows them to respond quickly to changing circumstances without remaining constantly tense. The neighborhood's social structures during this period created unique opportunities for children to observe how adults handled stress, uncertainty, and conflict. They watched neighbors discuss civil defense plans, share resources during drills, and support each other through periods of heightened tension. They saw communities come together around shared concerns while maintaining individual family privacy and independence. This social environment taught children about the balance between community cooperation and personal responsibility. They learned that people could work together effectively without losing their individual identity or autonomy. They observed how adults could share information and resources while respecting boundaries and maintaining dignity. These lessons created adults who can participate in group efforts while maintaining their own judgment and values. The academic performance of Cold War children reflected their psychological adaptation to uncertain circumstances in interesting ways. Many became excellent students, not because they were naturally more intelligent, but because they understood that knowledge and skills were forms of security that couldn't be taken away by external events. They approached learning with unusual seriousness because they sensed that what they learned might someday be crucial for survival. This created adults who value education and skill development throughout their lives. They don't see learning as something that ends with formal schooling, but as an ongoing process of building internal resources. They understand that expertise in multiple areas provides flexibility when circumstances change. They became lifelong learners not from intellectual curiosity alone, but from practical wisdom about the importance of adaptability. The communication patterns within Cold War families developed particular characteristics because parents had to share serious information with children while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Adults had to explain why certain precautions were necessary without creating overwhelming fear. They had to discuss real dangers while encouraging normal childhood development and optimism. This created family dynamics based on honest communication within age-appropriate limits. Children learned that adults would share important information with them, but they also learned that having information carried responsibilities. They developed trust in their parents' judgment while learning to form their own opinions about complex situations. These communication patterns created adults who can have difficult conversations with clarity and compassion. The holiday celebrations and family traditions during this period carried additional emotional weight because families were acutely aware that traditions could be interrupted by events beyond their control. Christmas gatherings felt more precious when families understood that next year's celebration wasn't guaranteed. Birthday parties became more meaningful when children grasped the fragility of individual life within larger historical forces. This awareness created adults who invest deeply in relationships and experiences rather than taking them for granted. They understand that time with loved ones is finite and valuable. They learn to create meaningful moments without needing perfect circumstances. They develop the ability to find joy and connection even when external conditions were stressful or uncertain. The bedtime routines of Cold War children carried psychological weight that previous generations never experienced. Picture yourself as an 8-year-old getting ready for bed while your parents whispered about missile tests or diplomatic breakdowns in the next room. You'd brush your teeth, put on your pajamas, and climb under covers, knowing that the world you woke up to might be fundamentally different from the one you were leaving behind. These children learn to fall asleep despite uncertainty, developing what researchers call comfort with ambiguity that would serve them throughout their lives. This nightly practice of releasing control over circumstances beyond their influence created adults who can rest despite ongoing problems. They don't need all their questions answered before they can find peace. They learn that sleep isn't something you earn by solving every worry, but something you choose despite legitimate concerns. When other people struggle with anxiety-induced insomnia, Cold War children develop the psychological capacity to compartmentalize daily stresses without denying their existence. The shopping experiences of this era reinforce these psychological patterns in unexpected ways. When families went to the grocery store, they weren't just buying food for the week. They were making decisions about emergency supplies, calculating how long certain items would last during extended isolation, considering which products required refrigeration versus those that could survive power outages. Children absorbed these calculations without fully understanding their implications. This created adults who shop differently from other generations. They naturally consider shelf life, storage requirements, and multiple uses for products they purchase. They don't buy compulsively, but they also don't assume stores will always be accessible when needed. They learn to think strategically about consumption in ways that seem excessive to people who grew up with different assumptions about supply chain reliability. Consider what it meant to receive mail during this period. Letters from relatives in other countries carried extra significance because geopolitical tensions could disrupt communication networks without warning. Postcards from family members traveling abroad were treasured not just as mementos, but as proof that people could still move freely between nations that might soon restrict such movement. Children learned that staying connected required effort and couldn't be taken for granted. This created adults who value communication deeply and don't assume that staying in touch is automatic. They understand that relationships require intentional maintenance, especially when external circumstances make connection more difficult. They learned to express important feelings clearly because they understood that opportunities for communication might be interrupted. They became people who don't leave important things unsaid. The medical and health consciousness of Cold War families developed particular characteristics because parents had to consider what would happen if normal healthcare systems became unavailable. Families learned basic first aid, not just for everyday injuries, but for situations where professional medical help might not be accessible. Children absorbed lessons about self-reliance in health matters that went far beyond typical childhood safety education. This created adults who take personal responsibility for their health and don't assume that medical professionals will always be available to solve problems. They learned basic skills for handling injuries and illnesses because they understood that depending entirely on external systems could be dangerous. They developed what researchers call medical self-efficacy, the confidence that they can handle health challenges even when optimal resources aren't available. The transportation patterns of Cold War childhood reflected these broader psychological themes in subtle but significant ways. Families planned trips with backup routes in mind, not because of traffic concerns, but because certain roads might become unavailable during emergencies. Children learned to pay attention to alternate paths, fuel levels, and vehicle maintenance in ways that seemed excessive for normal travel, but made sense given their circumstances. This created adults who travel with what they call reasonable precautions. They keep emergency supplies in their vehicles. They know multiple routes to important destinations, and they maintain their cars with unusual diligence. They don't expect breakdown assistance to always be available, and they don't assume that normal transportation infrastructure will function perfectly during crisis situations. The artistic and creative expression of Cold War children often incorporated themes of protection, concealment, and survival in ways that seemed natural rather than disturbing. They drew pictures of underground shelters, wrote stories about brave families surviving difficult times, and created games involving rescue scenarios and resource management. These creative outlets helped them process complex emotions about their circumstances. This creative processing created adults who can find constructive ways to deal with stress and uncertainty. They learned that imagination could be used to explore difficult possibilities safely, that artistic expression could help make sense of confusing situations, and that creativity could provide emotional relief without denying reality. They became people who can face hard truths while maintaining hope and finding beauty even in challenging circumstances. The peer relationships of Cold War children developed unique characteristics because these young people shared experiences that were unprecedented in human history. They could discuss nuclear strategy with the same casual tone they used for baseball statistics. They traded information about fallout patterns as easily as they exchanged comic books. They formed friendships based partly on shared understanding of circumstances that adults were still struggling to comprehend. This created adults who can form deep connections with people who understand their perspective while maintaining relationships with those who don't share their particular worldview. They learned that shared experience creates bonds, but they also learned that differences in background don't prevent meaningful connection. They developed the social intelligence to navigate relationships across different levels of awareness about serious issues. When you meet someone today who grew up during the Cold War, you're encountering a person shaped by forces unlike anything before or since. They carry within them a psychological architecture built from childhood experiences with existential uncertainty. And that architecture has created some of the most resilient, adaptable, and quietly confident people among us. They learned early that the world could change overnight, that safety required preparation rather than assumption, and that meaning could be found even when the future remained uncertain. In a world increasingly anxious about problems that feel overwhelming, these individuals stand as proof that humans can adapt to even the most challenging circumstances and emerge not just intact, but stronger. They remind us that resilience isn't about avoiding difficulty, but about developing the internal resources to navigate whatever comes next.